Sometimes the people we think we know best are strangers wearing familiar faces. Sometimes the quiet man who drives you to school every morning, who makes your lunch with careful hands, who never raises his voice even when you break his heart, carries secrets that could reshape your entire understanding of strength, justice, and what it truly means to protect the people you love. This is the story of Madison Chun, a 17-year-old girl who thought power came from fear, respect came from intimidation, and family was just another word for people who had to put up with you. She was wrong about all of it, and she was about to learn just how wrong in the most unexpected way possible. What started as another day of ruling her high school kingdom through cruelty and manipulation would become the day Madison discovered that real power doesn't announce itself with threats or demand attention through violence. Real power waits quietly in the background, watching, protecting, and only reveals itself when there's no other choice left. Her adoptive father had been keeping a secret for 15 years. A secret that would explain why he never seemed afraid of anything, why he always knew exactly what to say to defuse any situation, and why certain phone calls made him step outside and speak in voices she'd never heard before. Madison was about to learn that the man she'd taken for granted, dismissed as weak, and pushed away with her anger and rebellion, was someone she never could have imagined. And it all started with one final, terrible mistake that crossed a line she didn't even know existed. Madison Chun adjusted her designer backpack and surveyed her kingdom. Riverside High School stretched out before her like a chessboard, and she was the undisputed queen. Students moved through the hallways with quick glances in her direction, some hoping to catch her attention, others praying to remain invisible. She preferred the latter. Fear was so much cleaner than admiration. At 17, Madison had perfected the art of control. Her adoptive parents provided everything she wanted, her grades were decent enough to avoid lectures, and her social media following hung on her every post. Life was exactly as it should be, with everyone knowing their place in her carefully constructed hierarchy. Her phone buzzed with a text from her adoptive father, David Chun. "Hope you have a good day, kiddo. Remember to pack your favorite snacks. Love you." Madison rolled her eyes and shoved the phone back into her pocket without responding. David's relentless kindness had always annoyed her. Weakness disguised as love, she called it. The first period passed uneventfully. Madison held court at her usual table during lunch, surrounded by her carefully selected group of followers. Emma Martinez, her lieutenant, leaned in close to whisper the latest gossip. That new girl, Sarah, was asking about joining the drama club. Apparently, she thinks she's going to audition for the spring play. Madison's eyes narrowed as she spotted Sarah Kim across the cafeteria. The girl was sitting alone, reading a book while eating a sandwich that looked homemade. Everything about Sarah screamed different, from her thrift store clothes to her complete indifference to the social dynamics that ruled their school. Madison had been watching her for weeks, waiting for the right moment to establish the natural order. "Well," Madison said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, "someone needs to explain how things work around here." She stood with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention. The cafeteria's buzz dimmed as students sensed drama approaching. Madison made her way across the room, her heels clicking against the linoleum like a countdown timer. Sarah didn't look up from her book until Madison's shadow fell across the page. When she finally raised her head, Madison was surprised to see no trace of fear in the girl's dark eyes. Just curiosity and perhaps a hint of amusement. "Sarah Kim, right?" Madison's voice carried the false sweetness she used before delivering a blow. "I'm Meji-sun Chen. I run things here." "Nice to meet you," Sarah replied simply, marking her place in the book with a finger. "Is there something you needed?" The casual response threw Madison off balance. People didn't respond to her with such calm indifference. They either cowered or tried desperately to gain her favor. Sarah was doing neither. "I heard you want to try out for the spring play," Madison continued, regaining her composure. "That's cute, but you should know that starring roles go to people who've earned them, people who belong here." Sarah closed her book and looked directly at Madison. "I wasn't planning to audition for a starring role. I just like theater. How humble. Madison's voice dripped with sarcasm. But here's the thing about our little theater program. It's very selective, very exclusive, and, frankly, I'm not sure you'd fit in. The cafeteria had grown completely silent now. Even the lunch staff had stopped their chattering to watch the confrontation unfold. Madison felt the familiar rush of power that came with having an audience. What Madison means, Emma chimed in, appearing at her side like a loyal guard dog, is that the drama club has standards. Academic standards, social standards. It's not for everyone. Sarah's expression remained unchanged, but Madison caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Good. She was finally getting through. I appreciate your concern, Sarah said, standing up to face Madison directly. But I think I can handle whatever standards the drama club might have. The response was so reasonable, so maddeningly calm, that Madison felt her carefully maintained control beginning to slip. This girl didn't understand the game being played. She didn't recognize Madison's authority or show proper respect for the established order. Listen, Madison said, stepping closer and lowering her voice to a dangerous whisper. I'm trying to help you here. You seem nice enough, but you don't belong with us. You don't dress like us, you don't talk like us, and you certainly don't have the background for it. Maybe you should stick to activities more suited to your... She paused, letting her eyes rake over Sarah's second-hand clothes, circumstances. For the first time since the conversation began, Sarah's composure cracked slightly. A flush crept up her neck, and Madison smiled. Finally, she was making progress. My circumstances, Sarah repeated quietly. Come on, Madison pressed her advantage. We all know you're here on some kind of scholarship or aid program. That's fine, really. Everyone deserves an education. But try to join activities that require investment. Well, that's just setting yourself up for disappointment. The words hung in the air like poison. Madison watched Sarah's face change, saw the hurt flash across her features before being quickly masked. Around them, the cafeteria remained frozen in anticipation. Madison, the voice came from behind her, cold and disapproving. Madison turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez, the drama club sponsor, standing with her arms crossed. My office. Now, Mrs. Rodriguez, Madison began, switching instantly to her charm mode. I was just welcoming Sarah to our school community. I heard exactly what you were doing, the teacher replied sharply. Office. Both of you. As they walked toward Mrs. Rodriguez's office, Madison felt a familiar mixture of annoyance and confidence. She'd been in trouble before, and it never stuck. Her adoptive parents always handled things quietly, and her record remained pristine. This would be no different. The office was small and cluttered with posters from past school productions. Mrs. Rodriguez closed the door and turned to face both girls with an expression Madison recognized as disappointed authority figure number 3. Madison, what you just did out there was bullying, pure and simple, Mrs. Rodriguez began, making assumptions about Sarah's financial situation, trying to exclude her from school activities, creating a hostile environment. These are serious violations of our anti-bullying policies. Madison arranged her features into an expression of confused innocence. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just explaining how competitive our programs are. I was trying to help Sarah understand what she'd be getting into. By humiliating her in front of the entire cafeteria, Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was sharp. By making derogatory comments about her clothes and economic background, I never said anything derogatory, Madison protested, though her confidence was beginning to waver. Usually, teachers were more easily managed than this. Mrs. Rodriguez turned to Sarah, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Sarah, would you like to tell me your perspective on what just happened? Sarah looked between the teacher and Madison before speaking. Madison made it clear that she doesn't think I belong in the drama club because of my financial situation. She suggested that I should stick to activities more suited to my circumstances, which I took to mean activities for poor kids. The blunt honesty of the statement hit Madison like a slap. When laid out so simply, her words sounded exactly like what they were, cruel and classist. For a moment, she felt something uncomfortably like shame. "Madison," Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice heavy with disappointment, "I'm going to have to call your parents and schedule a meeting. This behavior is unacceptable, and there will be consequences." The shame evaporated instantly, replaced by familiar irritation. "Fine," Madison said, standing up. "My father will sort this out. He always does." But, as she left the office, Madison couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face when she'd mentioned her circumstances. For just a moment, she'd seen real hurt there, quickly hidden but unmistakably genuine. It was the kind of hurt that came from hitting someone exactly where they were most vulnerable. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sideways glances. By the time Madison walked out to the parking lot, the story had grown and evolved through multiple retellings. Some versions had her destroying Sarah completely. Others had Mrs. Rodriguez threatening suspension. Madison didn't bother correcting any of them. Let people think what they wanted. David was waiting in his usual spot, reading something on his phone while leaning against their silver sedan. He looked up as Madison approached, and she was surprised to see an expression she didn't recognize. Not anger exactly, but something close to it. "How was school?" he asked as she got into the passenger seat. "Fine," Madison replied automatically, pulling out her phone to avoid conversation. "Mrs. Rodriguez called," David said quietly as he started the engine. Madison's stomach dropped, but she kept her voice level. "About what?" "About what happened in the cafeteria today. About what you said to that girl." "It was a misunderstanding," Madison said, repeating her earlier defense. Mrs. Rodriguez overreacted to a simple conversation. David was quiet for several long moments as he navigated through the school's parking lot traffic. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than she'd ever heard it. Tired, disappointed. "Madison, we're going to have a serious conversation when we get home. Your mother and I need to talk to you about what happened today and about some changes that need to be made." "Changes?" Madison's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "What kind of changes?" "The kind that should have been made a long time ago," David replied, and Madison heard something in his voice that made her skin crawl. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was resolve, the kind of quiet determination that suggested her usual tactics weren't going to work this time. As they drove through their upscale neighborhood, Madison stared out the window at the perfectly manicured lawns and expensive cars, trying to push down a growing sense of unease. Something felt different about this situation, though she couldn't put her finger on what. David's reaction wasn't following the usual script, and that worried her more than she wanted to admit. When they pulled into their driveway, Madison could see her adoptive mother, Linda, waiting in the kitchen window. Her expression was serious, and Madison realized with growing alarm that this wasn't going to be another easily managed parent conference. "Inside," David said simply as he turned off the engine. "We need to talk." Madison followed him toward the house, her mind racing through potential strategies and explanations. She'd navigated parental disappointment before. She could handle whatever lecture was coming her way. But as David held the front door open for her, Madison caught something in his eyes that made her steps falter. It was the look of someone who had finally run out of patience. And for the first time in years, Madison Chun felt genuinely afraid of what was coming next. The afternoon sun slanted through their living room windows as Madison settled onto the familiar leather couch, preparing for a battle she was no longer certain she could win. Outside, the neighborhood continued its quiet suburban routine, but inside their house, everything was about to change in ways Madison couldn't possibly imagine. Her adoptive father's secret was still safely hidden, but the events set in motion by her cruelty towards Sarah Kim had started a chain reaction that would eventually expose everything. For now, though, Madison could only see as far as the disappointed faces of the people who loved her, preparing to finally draw the lines they should have drawn years ago. The living room felt smaller than usual as Madison faced her adoptive parents. Linda Chun sat in her favorite armchair, her usually warm expression replaced by something Madison had rarely seen before, genuine disappointment mixed with firm resolve. David remained standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded Madison of a soldier at attention, though she couldn't say why. "Sit down, Madison," Linda said quietly. "We need to have a conversation that's long overdue." Madison perched on the edge of the couch, her defenses already rising. "Look, if this is about what happened with that new girl," Mrs. Rodriguez completely blew it out of proportion. "I was just explaining how things work at school. By telling Sarah Kim that she doesn't belong because of her financial situation." David's voice was controlled, but Madison heard something underneath it that made her shift uncomfortably. "By humiliating her in front of your entire school." "I didn't humiliate anyone," Madison protested, though the words fell hollow even to her. "I was being realistic about the social dynamics of high school. Someone had to tell her." Linda leaned forward, her expression pained. "Madison, do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying?" "I'm saying that some people fit in and some people don't," Madison replied, her voice rising defensively. "That's just how the world works. I didn't create the system." "No," David said quietly, "but you've chosen to use it as a weapon." The words hit harder than Madison expected. She looked between her adoptive parents, seeing expressions she'd never encountered before. They weren't just disappointed in her behavior. They were disappointed in who she'd become. "We've been having conversations about you for months," Linda continued. "Your teachers, your friends' parents, people in our community. The picture they paint of you isn't someone we recognize." Madison felt her control slipping and grasped for familiar ground. "My grades are fine. I haven't broken any major rules. I've never been suspended or arrested or anything like that." "You're absolutely right," David said, moving away from the window to sit across from her. "On paper, you're a model student. But character isn't measured by what you don't get caught doing, Madison. It's measured by what you choose to do when no one's watching." "And when people are watching," Linda added softly, "you choose cruelty." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Madison felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. "That's not fair. I'm not cruel. I'm just honest about how things are." "Tell me," David said, his voice taking on a tone Madison had never heard before, "what you know about Sarah Kim's circumstances." "What do you mean?" "I mean specifically. What do you know about her family, her background, her reasons for being at your school?" Madison faltered. "She's obviously on some kind of financial aid. Her clothes are from thrift stores. She brings homemade lunches. She doesn't have the newest phone. It's pretty obvious." "So you made assumptions," Linda said. "And based on those assumptions, you decided she didn't deserve the same opportunities as you." "I didn't say she didn't deserve them," Madison shot back. "I just pointed out that she might not fit in." David was quiet for a long moment, studying his adoptive daughter with an expression that made Madison want to squirm. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "Madison, Sarah Kim's father, is Dr. James Kim, one of the most respected cardiac surgeons in the state. Her mother is a former federal prosecutor who now teaches law at the university. Sarah chooses to dress simply and bring homemade lunches because her family values humility and environmental responsibility, not because they can't afford alternatives." The words hit Madison like a physical blow. She felt heat creep up her neck as the full weight of her mistake crashed over her. Not only had she been cruel, she'd been spectacularly wrong. "How do you know that?" she asked weakly. "Because," David replied, "Dr. Kim called me this afternoon. He wanted to discuss what happened to his daughter and to understand how we're planning to address it." Madison's mouth went dry. The idea that Sarah's parents knew what had happened, that they'd reached out to her adoptive parents directly, made the situation exponentially worse. This wasn't just a school incident anymore. It was becoming something much more serious. "Sarah didn't want her parents to know," David continued, "but Mrs. Rodriguez felt the situation warranted their involvement. Apparently, what you said to Sarah wasn't the first incident. She's been dealing with comments and exclusion from your social circle for weeks." "I never," Madison began, then stopped, because she had. Maybe not directly, but she made it clear through her actions and her followers' behavior that Sarah wasn't welcome in their sphere. The realization made her feel sick. "Dr. Kim was very gracious," Linda said quietly. much more gracious than he had any right to be under the circumstances. But he made it clear that this pattern of behavior needs to stop, and he wanted to understand what steps we're taking to ensure it doesn't happen again. Madison looked between her adoptive parents, seeing something new in their expressions. For the first time in her life, they looked truly disappointed in her, not just her behavior, but in who she was as a person. The realization was terrifying. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. "We want you to understand," David said, "that your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the people you hurt." Sarah Kim went home today feeling humiliated and unwelcome at her new school because of choices you made. "And we want you to understand," Linda added, "that the person you become isn't someone we can continue to enable or protect from the consequences of her actions." The words sent a chill down Madison's spine. "What does that mean?" David and Linda exchanged a look that Madison couldn't read, but it felt significant, like they'd already had long conversations about this moment and had come to decisions she wasn't going to like. "It means," David said carefully, "that things are going to change, starting immediately. Your car privileges are suspended indefinitely," Linda began, consulting a list she'd apparently prepared. "Your credit cards are canceled. Your allowance is stopped. And you'll be getting a job to earn spending money and to begin understanding the value of work." Madison's jaw dropped. "You can't be serious. How am I supposed to get to school? How am I supposed to maintain my social commitments?" "The school bus," David replied simply. "And perhaps it's time to reconsider which social commitments are actually worth maintaining." "You're ruining my life," Madison exploded, jumping to her feet. "None of my friends will understand this. Do you know how embarrassing it will be to take the bus? To not have spending money? To have to work some minimum wage job, like—" She stopped abruptly, realizing what she'd been about to say. Like poor people. Like the kind of people she looked down on. The kind of person she'd assumed Sarah was. "Like what, Madison?" David's voice was dangerously quiet. "Like what kind of people?" Madison sank back onto the couch, the fight going out of her as she realized how completely she'd exposed herself. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Linda said gently but firmly. "And that's exactly the problem. You've somehow gotten the idea that your worth as a person is tied to material things, and that other people's worth can be judged by what they have or don't have." "Where do we go wrong?" David asked, more to himself than to Madison. "How do we raise someone who thinks this way?" The question cut deeper than any punishment could have. Madison had never seen her adoptive father look so lost, so genuinely confused about how they'd arrived at this point. It occurred to her for the first time that her behavior wasn't just hurting strangers like Sarah Kim. It was hurting the two people who'd loved her unconditionally for 15 years. "I don't think this way all the time," Madison said weakly. School is complicated. There are social dynamics you don't understand." "Then, help us understand," Linda said. "Explain to us why you felt the need to humiliate a girl who had done nothing to you." Madison struggled to find words that would make her actions sound reasonable. But, under her adoptive parents' steady gazes, the explanations that had seemed logical in her head sounded petty and cruel when spoken aloud. "She was different," Madison said finally. "She didn't fit in. People were going to notice that eventually anyway. And you decided to make sure they noticed immediately," David said. "You decided to point it out in the most hurtful way possible." "I was protecting the social order," Madison tried again. "If just anyone can join any activity, then nothing means anything anymore." The words sounded ridiculous even to her, but they were the closest she could come to explaining the fear that had driven her actions. The fear that if the rules she'd learned to navigate so successfully were meaningless, then maybe she was meaningless too. David studied her for a long moment, and Madison caught something in his expression that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood something about her motivations that she hadn't even understood herself. "Madison," he said slowly, "you know that you're adopted. You know that Linda and I chose you when you were 2 years old." Madison nodded, confused by the change in direction. "Of course I know that. Do you remember what your life was like before that?" The question caught Madison off guard. She had vague memories of the time before David and Linda, but they were fragmented and uncomfortable. A series of foster homes, uncertainty, the constant fear of being moved again. Not really, she admitted. Why? Because, Linda said gently, we're wondering if some of your need to establish hierarchy and control comes from that time. From a period when you had no control and no security. The suggestion made Madison defensive. That has nothing to do with this, doesn't it? David asked. Think about what you told Sarah today. You essentially told her that she didn't belong, that she wasn't good enough, that she should know her place. How do you think that felt to a girl who's starting at a new school, trying to find where she fits in? The parallel hit Madison like a punch to the stomach. She'd taken her own deepest fear, not belonging, not being good enough, and weaponized it against someone else. The realization made her feel physically ill. I didn't think about it like that, she said quietly. We know, Linda replied. But that's part of the problem. You've gotten so focused on protecting your own position that you've stopped thinking about how your actions affect other people. David leaned forward, his expression serious, but not unkind. Madison, 15 years ago, you were a little girl who'd been through more trauma and uncertainty than any child should experience. When we brought you home, you were scared, defensive, and convinced that you had to fight for everything you wanted because no one was going to give it to you freely. Madison felt tears prick at her eyes, though she couldn't say exactly why. We thought, David continued, that love and security would eventually heal those wounds. That once you felt safe and wanted, you'd be able to let your guard down and just be a kid. But somewhere along the way, you learned to use your defenses as weapons instead of just protection. We failed you, Linda said softly. We gave you everything you wanted, but forgot to teach you why you should care about other people getting what they needed too. The tears Madison had been fighting began to fall despite her efforts to stop them. She hadn't cried in front of her adoptive parents in years, had trained herself to see tears as weakness. But something about their words, about the gentle way they were dismantling her defenses, broke through barriers she'd built without even realizing it. I don't know how to be different, she admitted, the words coming out in a whisper. That's why things have to change, David said, his voice kind but firm. You're going to apologize to Sarah Kim, publicly and sincerely. You're going to examine the way you treat people and make changes. And you're going to start understanding that your worth isn't determined by your position in some imaginary hierarchy. Madison nodded through her tears, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that terrified her. But underneath the fear, there was something else, a tiny spark of relief. As if a weight she'd been carrying without realizing it was finally being lifted. The job isn't just punishment, it's perspective. You need to understand what it's like to work for things, to depend on other people's kindness, to not have control over every aspect of your environment. What kind of job? Madison asked, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. David and Linda exchanged another look, and Madison caught something that looked almost like amusement. We'll figure that out together, David said. But it's going to be something that puts you in direct contact with people from different backgrounds and circumstances. Something that challenges your assumptions about what people deserve and why. As the conversation wound down, Madison felt emotionally drained but strangely clearer than she had in months. The punishments her adoptive parents had outlined would be difficult and embarrassing, but she was beginning to understand that they might also be necessary. What she didn't understand yet was how much more was coming. How her actions towards Sarah Kim had set in motion a series of events that would eventually reveal secrets her adoptive father had kept hidden for decades. How her adoptive parents' disappointment was nothing compared to the reckoning that awaited her. For now, though, Madison could only focus on the immediate consequences of her choices and the long, difficult work of becoming someone worth forgiving. The girl who had ruled Riverside High School with cruelty and manipulation was about to learn what it meant to start over from the bottom. And her adoptive father, watching her cry on their living room couch, was already making phone calls that would change everything. Because David Chun had secrets of his own, and Madison's behavior had finally push him to a point where those secrets might need to be revealed. The next morning arrived gray and cold, matching Madison's mood as she stood at the bus stop for the first time in 3 years. The yellow school bus felt like a public announcement of her downfall, and she could already imagine the whispers that would follow her through the hallways of Riverside High. Several of her former followers had already texted, confused about why she wasn't picking them up as usual. Madison had spent most of the night crafting responses that would minimize the damage to her reputation, but every explanation sounded pathetic when she tried to type it out. How could she explain that her parents had discovered who she really was and decided it wasn't acceptable? The bus ride was exactly as humiliating as she'd expected. She found an empty seat near the back and tried to ignore the curious stares from underclassmen who recognized her. By the time they reached school, Madison felt like everyone was looking at her differently, as if they could sense that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully constructed world. Sarah Kim was standing by her locker when Madison finally worked up the courage to approach her. The hallway around them gradually quieted as students sensed drama brewing, but this time Madison felt exposed rather than powerful. "Sarah," Madison said, her voice shakier than she'd intended. "Can I talk to you?" Sarah looked up from her textbooks, and Madison was surprised to see no trace of anger or smugness in her expression, just wariness and a hint of curiosity. "Sure," Sarah said simply, closing her locker. Madison glanced around at their audience and realized that apologizing publicly was going to be even harder than she'd imagined. But her adoptive parents' words from the night before echoed in her head. Real consequences for real harm. "I want to apologize," Madison began, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "What I said to you yesterday was wrong. I made assumptions about your background that were completely unfair, and I tried to exclude you from school activities for no good reason." Sarah studied Madison's face for a long moment before responding. "Why did you do it?" The question caught Madison off guard. She prepared the apology, but she hadn't expected to be asked to explain her motivations. "I don't know," Madison said, then realized how inadequate that sounded. "I mean, I thought I was protecting something, but I can't even explain what. I was being territorial about things that don't belong to me." Territorial, sararapaturi. That's an interesting way to put it. "My parents made me realize that what I did to you was what I'd been afraid of having done to me," Madison continued, surprised by her own honesty. "I was so worried about not fitting in that I decided to make sure you felt that way instead." For the first time since Madison had approached her, Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That must be exhausting." "What?" "Being that afraid all the time," Sarah explained. "Constantly worrying about your position, always looking for threats. That sounds really lonely." Madison felt tears threaten again, caught off guard by Sarah's unexpected kindness. She'd expected anger, demands for further humiliation, maybe even righteous rejection of her apology. She hadn't expected understanding. "It kind of is," Madison admitted quietly. "I accept your apology," Sarah said after a moment. "But I have a question for you." "Okay. Are you apologizing because you understand why what you did was wrong, or because your parents made you?" Madison considered lying, giving the answer that would make her look better. But something about Sarah's direct gaze made dishonesty feel impossible. "Both," Madison said finally. "My parents definitely made me, but talking to them last night made me realize things about myself that I didn't want to see." Sarah nodded, as if the honest answer was exactly what she'd been hoping for. "Then maybe this is a chance for you to figure out who you want to be instead of who you think you have to be." The conversation ended there, leaving Madison feeling strangely lighter as she walked to her first class. The public apology had gone better than she'd dared to hope, but more importantly, it had given her a glimpse of a different way of being in the world, a way that didn't require constant vigilance and cruelty. The rest of the morning passed quietly until Madison was called to the principal's office during third period. She assumed it was a continuation of the disciplinary process from the day before, but when she arrived, she found Dr. Kim waiting alongside Principal Foster. Dr. Kim was not what Madison had expected. Tall and distinguished with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, He looked more like a favorite uncle than the intimidating authority figure she'd imagined. His presence made Madison's stomach clench with renewed shame. "Madison," Principal Foster said, "Dr. Kim asked to speak with you about yesterday's incident." Madison looked between the two adults, trying to gauge the mood in the room. Dr. Kim's expression was unreadable, neither angry nor friendly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," Dr. Kim said once Principal Foster had left them alone. "I want to talk to you about what happened between you and Sarah." "I apologized to her this morning," Madison said quickly. "I know what I did was wrong." "I'm glad to hear that," Dr. Kim replied. "But I want to talk to you about something else, about assumptions and the harm they can cause, even when we think we're being clever." Madison felt her face flush, understanding that Dr. Kim was referring to her completely incorrect assessment of Sarah's family situation. "Sarah told me what you said about her circumstances," Dr. Kim continued gently, "about how she should stick to activities suited to her background." "I was completely wrong," Madison said miserably. "I made assumptions based on how she dresses, and I was totally off base." "You were," Dr. Kim agreed. "But what concerns me more is that you thought those assumptions, even if they had been correct, would justify treating her differently." The observation hit home harder than any lecture about being wrong could have. Madison realized that Dr. Kim was right. Even if Sarah had been from a low-income family, even if she had been on financial aid, that wouldn't have made Madison's cruelty acceptable. "You're right," Madison said quietly. "Even if I'd been right about her background, it wouldn't have mattered. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect." Dr. Kim studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's exactly right. And I think you're beginning to understand something important about character." "What do you mean?" "Character isn't about what you have or where you come from," Dr. Kim explained. "It's about how you treat people who have less power than you do. How you behave when you think no one important is watching." Madison felt the words settle into her chest like stones. She thought about all the times she'd been casually cruel to people she'd deemed unimportant, all the small cruelty she'd inflicted because she could. "Why are you telling me this?" Madison asked. "Why aren't you just angry at me?" Dr. Kim smiled slightly. "Because anger doesn't teach anything useful. And because I think you're capable of learning from this experience if you're willing to do the work." "What kind of work?" "The hard kind," Dr. Kim replied. "The kind that requires you to examine your beliefs and change behaviors that have probably served you well in some ways." They talked for another few minutes about empathy and responsibility, and when Madison finally left the principal's office, she felt like she'd been given a gift she didn't deserve. Dr. Kim's kindness in the face of her cruelty toward his daughter was humbling in a way that punishment never could have been. That evening, Madison found herself in the unusual position of looking forward to dinner with her adoptive parents. She wanted to tell them about her conversation with Dr. Kim, about the way his unexpected grace had affected her more than anger would have. But when she walked into the kitchen, she found David and Linda deep in conversation, their voices low and serious. They looked up as she entered, and Madison caught something in their expressions that made her pause. "Is everything okay?" she asked. David and Linda exchanged a look that Madison was beginning to recognize as their new form of silent communication about her situation. "We need to talk to you about the job we mentioned," Linda said carefully. "We found something that we think will be good for you, but it's going to require some adjustments." Madison sat down at the kitchen table, trying to read their faces. "What kind of job?" "There's a community center downtown that provides after-school programs for kids from low-income families," David explained. "They need help with tutoring, activity supervision, basic administrative tasks. It's volunteer work, but they've agreed to provide a small stipend for transportation and meals." Madison's first instinct was to protest. A community center downtown was about as far from her usual world as she could imagine. But something in her adoptive parents' expressions warned her that this wasn't a negotiation. "Okay," she said carefully. "When do I start?" "Monday," Linda replied. "David will drive you for the first week until you get familiar with the bus route." The mention of David driving her caught Madison's attention. Her adoptive father rarely left work early enough to drive her anywhere during the week. In fact, now that she thought about it, David's work schedule had always been somewhat mysterious. He left early and came home at reasonable hours, but he never talked much about what he did during the day. "Won't that interfere with your work?" Madison asked. David's expression flickered for just a moment, and Madison caught something that looked almost like discomfort. "I can arrange my schedule to make it work." There was something in the way he said it that made Madison curious. But before she could ask more questions, Linda was explaining the details of her new volunteer position. The conversation moved on, but Madison filed away the moment of uncertainty she'd glimpsed in David's face. Later that night, as Madison lay in bed thinking about everything that had changed in the past 2 days, she found herself wondering about her adoptive parents in ways she never had before. Their decision to enforce real consequences for her behavior had surprised her, but it had also revealed a strength and determination she hadn't recognized before. David, in particular, seemed different somehow. More serious, more purposeful, as if dealing with her crisis had awakened something in him that had been dormant for years. Madison couldn't shake the feeling that there were layers to her adoptive father that she'd never bothered to explore. She thought about Dr. Kim's words about character being revealed in how you treat people with less power. She thought about Sarah's unexpected kindness and her adoptive parents' patient determination to help her become a better person. And she thought about the community center job waiting for her, full of children whose circumstances might be very different from her own. For the first time in years, Madison found herself genuinely curious about other people's lives rather than focused solely on protecting her own position. It was a small shift, but it felt significant, like the first crack in a wall that had been built so long ago she'd forgotten it was there. What Madison didn't know was that her adoptive father was lying awake in the next room, making difficult decisions about secrets he'd kept for 15 years. David Chun had built his entire civilian identity around being unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of quiet family man who never drew attention or questions. But Madison's crisis was forcing him toward situations that might require him to step out of that carefully constructed anonymity. The community-centered job wasn't random. It was in a neighborhood where David's past work had left deep connections and complicated loyalties. Taking Madison there regularly would mean risking exposure of identity he'd worked decades to bury. Yet watching his adoptive daughter struggle with questions of character and purpose had reminded David of why he'd left his old life behind in the first place. Some things were more important than maintaining cover. Some lessons could only be learned through experience. As David stared at the ceiling, weighing risks and obligations, he made a decision that would change everything. Madison needed to learn about strength and protection and what it really meant to serve people who couldn't protect themselves. And if teaching her those lessons meant revealing who he really was, then that was a risk worth taking. The community center job would expose Madison to a world she'd never imagined. But it would also expose her to a side of her adoptive father that would redefine everything she thought she knew about power, courage, and what it truly meant to be strong. Monday was going to be very interesting for everyone involved. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that made Madison pull her jacket tighter as she waited for David by their car. She'd barely slept, anxiety churning in her stomach about starting work at the community center. Everything about her life felt uncertain now, like she was walking on ground that might give way at any moment. David appeared carrying a travel mug of coffee and wearing clothes Madison had never seen before. Instead of his usual business casual attire, he was dressed in dark jeans, boots, and a plain black jacket that somehow made him look different. Harder, more substantial. "Ready?" he asked, and Madison noticed his voice sounded different too. More focused, like he was preparing for something important. The drive downtown took them through neighborhoods Madison had never really paid attention to before. As her familiar suburban world gave way to older buildings and busier streets, she found herself studying the people they passed with new curiosity. The elderly woman walking a small dog, the man in work clothes heading toward the bus stop, the teenagers gathered outside a corner store, all of them living lives completely separate from hers. Tell me about this place we're going, Madison said as they turned onto a street lined with modest houses and small businesses. Haven Oaks Community Center, David replied, his eyes constantly moving as he scanned their surroundings in a way that seemed automatic. They served about 300 kids from the surrounding neighborhoods. After-school programs, tutoring, meals, safe space to do homework. Have you been there before? David was quiet for a moment. Once or twice. Something in his tone suggested there was more to that story, but before Madison could ask, they were pulling into a small parking lot beside a converted warehouse with colorful murals covering its brick walls. The center was already busy despite the early hour. Children ranging from elementary age to teenagers were scattered around a large open space, some working at tables, others playing games, a few helping adults with various tasks. The atmosphere was energetic but purposeful, and Madison felt immediately out of place. Madison and David Chun. A woman approached them with a warm smile and an outstretched hand. I'm Carmen Reyes, the program director. Thank you so much for volunteering with us. Carmen was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. As she shook Madison's hand, Madison felt like she was being carefully evaluated. Madison, let me show you around and introduce you to some of our kids, Carmen said. David, Miguel is in the office if you want to say hello. Madison watched her adoptive father's reaction to this casual suggestion and caught another flicker of something she couldn't quite identify. David nodded and headed toward the office area with a familiarity that contradicted his claim of having only visited once or twice. Carmen led Madison through the center, explaining the various programs and introducing her to children who looked up at her with curious, sometimes wary eyes. Madison found herself paying attention in a way she rarely did, genuinely trying to understand what these kids' lives were like. This is Aisha, Carmen said, stopping at a table where a girl about 10 years old was working on math homework. She's one of our star students. Aisha, this is Madison. She's going to be helping out around here. Aisha looked up from her worksheet and studied Madison with serious dark eyes. Are you going to stay, or are you just here for community service hours? The blunt question caught Madison off guard. I'm planning to stay for a while. Good, Aisha said simply, then returned to her math problems. As they continued the tour, Madison began to understand that these children had learned to be cautious about adults who showed up temporarily in their lives. They'd been disappointed before by people who made promises they didn't keep. Why do you do this? Madison asked Carmen as they watched a group of teenagers working on a mural project. Because these kids deserve the same opportunities as any other kids, Carmen replied. They deserve adults who believe in them and spaces where they can be successful. It was a simple answer, but something about the way Carmen said it reminded Madison of Dr. Kim's words about character being revealed in how you treat people with less power. These children had very little power in the world, and yet the adults here treated them with respect and genuine care. Madison was assigned to help with homework tutoring, and she found herself working with a mix of elementary and middle school students. The work was harder than she'd expected, requiring patience and creativity as she tried to explain concepts in ways that made sense to children whose educational experiences had been very different from her own. I don't get why we have to learn this stuff, complained Marcus, a 7th grader struggling with pre-algebra. When am I ever going to use it? Madison started to give him the standard adult response about education being important, then stopped. Marcus deserved a better answer than empty platitudes. You know what? She said instead. I used to think the same thing. But I think maybe the point isn't really about the math itself. It's about proving to yourself that you can figure out hard things when you put your mind to it. Marcus considered this, then bent back over his worksheet with slightly more focus. Madison felt a small glow of satisfaction at having actually helped instead of just going through the motions. After 2 hours of tutoring, Carmen called a break, and Madison went looking for David. She found him in the office area, deep in conversation with a man she assumed was Miguel. But as she approached, she caught fragments of their discussion that made no sense. Situation in the East Quadrant has been escalating, Miguel was saying. I know, David replied, his voice taking on that focused tone Madison had noticed in the car. "We've been monitoring it, but if it continues to develop, we might need to consider intervention." "The families are starting to ask for help," Miguel continued. "They trust you, and, frankly, some of these problems are beyond what civilian authorities can handle." Madison stopped just outside the office door, confused by what she was hearing. David sounded like he was discussing some kind of ongoing security situation, which made no sense. Her adoptive father worked in. Actually, Madison realized she'd never been entirely clear about what David did for work. "I retired from that life for good reasons," David was saying. "But if people are in danger, just think about it," Miguel replied. "These kids and families need protection that only someone with your skills can provide." Madison's confusion deepened. What skills? What kind of protection? She'd always assumed David worked in some kind of consulting or business role. Nothing about their conversation suggested anything like that. Before she could process what she'd heard, David appeared in the doorway and spotted her. "How did the tutoring go?" he asked, switching instantly back to the voice and demeanor she recognized. "Good," Madison replied, studying his face for traces of the other person she'd just heard speaking. "Dad, what kind of work do you do exactly?" David's expression didn't change, but Madison caught the slightest pause before he answered. "I help organizations solve problems." It wasn't really an answer at all, Madison realized. It was the kind of vague response that sounded informative, but revealed nothing. "What kind of problems?" "Security issues, mostly. Risk assessment. That sort of thing." Miguel appeared behind David, and Madison saw something pass between the two men that looked like a warning. As if Miguel was reminding David to be careful about what he revealed. "Madison," Miguel said with a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How are you liking the center?" "It's different than I expected," Madison replied honestly. "The kids are amazing." "They are," Miguel agreed. "And they're lucky to have people like your father looking out for them." There was something in the way Miguel said it that suggested layers Madison wasn't understanding. She looked between the two men, sensing undercurrents she couldn't decode. The ride home was quiet, with David seeming lost in thought as he navigated through traffic. Madison found herself studying her adoptive father with new eyes, trying to reconcile the man she'd grown up with and the person she'd glimpsed at the community center. "Dad," she said as they pulled into their driveway. "Miguel seemed to know you pretty well for someone you've only met once or twice." David turned off the engine and sat still for a moment before answering. "Miguel and I have some history together." "What kind of history?" "The complicated kind," David replied, which again wasn't really an answer. That evening at dinner, Madison found herself watching David with newfound curiosity. She'd spent 17 years taking for granted that she knew who her adoptive parents were, but now she was beginning to suspect there were depths to David she'd never explored. "How was your first day?" Linda asked, and Madison noticed that David had already filled her in on basic details. "Different than I expected," Madison said. "The kids are really smart and resilient, but they're dealing with problems I never really thought about before." "Such as?" Madison considered how to explain what she'd observed. "Safety issues in their neighborhoods. Parents who work multiple jobs and can't always be around. Schools that don't have enough resources. Things like that." She saw David and Linda exchange a look across the table, but couldn't interpret its meaning. "Did you feel like you were able to help?" Linda asked. "A little," Madison said. "But mostly I felt like I was learning more than I was teaching." "That's probably exactly what you needed," David said quietly, and something in his tone made Madison think he was speaking from personal experience. Later that night, Madison found herself unable to sleep. She kept replaying fragments of the conversation she'd overheard between David and Miguel, trying to make sense of references to situations and interventions and skills she didn't understand. She thought about the way David had moved through the community center with obvious familiarity, despite claiming he'd barely been there. The way Miguel had deferred to him like someone with authority. The way David had seemed to become a different person entirely when he thought she wasn't watching. Madison crept out of bed and down the hallway, planning to get a glass of water from the kitchen. But as she passed David's home office, she noticed light seeping under the door. She could hear him talking quietly on the phone, his voice carrying that same focused tone she'd heard earlier. "Understand your concerns, but I've been out of the game for 15 years. David was saying, "I have a family now. Responsibilities that take priority." Madison pressed closer to the door, straining to hear more. "I know what the families are facing," David continued. "And I know that local law enforcement isn't equipped to handle organized threats of this nature. But bringing me back in opens up complications that could put my daughter at risk." Madison's heart started racing. What kind of organized threats? What game had David been out of? And why would helping people put her at risk? "Look," David said after a long pause, "give me 48 hours to think about it. If the situation escalates beyond what you can handle through normal channels, we'll revisit this conversation." Madison heard footsteps approaching the office door and quickly retreated to her room, her mind spinning with questions and implications she couldn't fully process. As she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Madison realized that discovering her own capacity for cruelty had been only the beginning of revelations that would reshape her understanding of the world. Her adoptive father wasn't who she believed him to be, and whatever secrets he was keeping were serious enough to put them both in danger. The community center job that was supposed to teach her about empathy and responsibility was revealing mysteries that went far deeper than character development. And Madison had the unsettling feeling that her crisis of conscience had awakened something in David that had been deliberately buried for very good reasons. Tomorrow's volunteer session was going to be very different. Now that Madison understood, she was walking into a situation where nothing was quite what it seemed, including the quiet man who'd been protecting her for 15 years without her ever realizing she needed protection. Tuesday arrived with an urgency that Madison couldn't explain. She woke before her alarm, her mind already racing with questions about David's mysterious phone call and the implications of everything she'd overheard. The mundane routine of getting ready for school felt surreal when she suspected her entire understanding of her family was built on foundations she'd never examined. At school, Madison found herself distracted during classes, her thoughts returning constantly to fragments of conversation about organized threats and skills that could put her at risk. When Sarah Kim approached her after third period, Madison was almost grateful for the interruption. "How did your first day at the community center go?" Sarah asked. Madison looked at her in surprise. They'd barely spoken since the apology, and she hadn't expected Sarah to follow up on personal details. "It was eye-opening," Madison replied honestly. "The kids there dealing with challenges I never really understood before." "That's good," Sarah said. "I mean, good that you're learning about different perspectives. My mom always says that understanding other people's struggles is the first step toward becoming someone who can actually help." "Your mom sounds wise," Madison said, then hesitated before adding, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you moved here, did you research the area? Like, did your parents look into safety issues or anything like that?" Sarah gave her a curious look. "A little." "Why?" "I'm just wondering if there are problems in some neighborhoods that people don't talk about openly. Things that affect the kids at the community center, but don't make it into official reports or news stories." "You mean like gang activity or drug trafficking?" Sarah asked. "Because, yeah, my parents were definitely aware of some areas where those issues are more prevalent." Madison felt a chill run down her spine. Gang activity, drug trafficking, the kind of organized threats that local law enforcement might not be equipped to handle. How do people usually deal with those kinds of problems? Madison pressed. Sarah studied her with growing concern. "Madison, is everything okay? You seem really worried about something specific." Before Madison could respond, the bell rang, signaling the end of passing period. As they walked toward their respective classes, Madison found herself wishing she could confide in Sarah about her growing suspicions. But how could she explain that she thought her adoptive father might be connected to some kind of security work that involved organized crime? The rest of the school day dragged by with excruciating slowness. When David finally picked her up for their second trip to the community center, Madison was wound tight with nervous energy. "You're quiet today," David observed as they navigated downtown traffic. Just thinking about things, Madison replied, studying his profile for clues about the person she was beginning to suspect existed beneath his familiar surface. What kind of things? Madison considered her words carefully. About problems that are too big for normal solutions. About what happens when regular authorities can't protect people. David's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, and Madison caught the subtle change in his posture, like someone preparing for a difficult conversation. That's a pretty sophisticated topic for someone who's been volunteering for one day, David said carefully. Maybe I'm more observant than you think, Madison replied, watching his face for reactions. They arrived at the community center to find an atmosphere noticeably different from the day before. Carmen met them at the entrance with a strained smile and eyes that kept darting toward the parking lot as if she was watching for something. Madison, we're going to have you work with the older kids today, Carmen said. Some of our usual volunteers couldn't make it, so we need extra help with the teenagers. David stepped closer to Carmen, and Madison heard him ask quietly, "Any developments since yesterday?" Carmen nodded grimly. "Miguel wants to talk to you before you leave." Madison felt her suspicions crystallize into certainty. Whatever David's connection to this place, it went far beyond casual volunteering. And whatever problems they were facing were serious enough to require his specific expertise. Working with the teenage group provided Madison with insights that made her stomach clench with worry. These kids were smart, resilient, and matter-of-fact about dangers that Madison had never imagined existing in her world. "My little brother walks a different route home now," 16-year-old Jamie explained during a break between activities. "Ever since those new guys started hanging around the corner by the bodega." "New guys?" Madison asked, tried to keep her voice casual. "Yeah, they're not from around here." Another teenager, Carlos, chimed in. "They've been asking questions about who runs things in the neighborhood, who the kids belong to. Makes people nervous." Madison felt her blood run cold. These children were talking about potential threats to their safety with the same casual tone they might use to discuss homework assignments. And their parents were worried enough to change daily routines and seek help from people like David. "Have you talked to the police about this?" Madison asked. Jamie and Carlos exchanged a look that spoke volumes about their confidence in official protection. "Police don't really handle this kind of thing," Carlos explained patiently. "They show up after something happens, write reports, maybe arrest some low-level guys who get replaced next week. But dealing with organized groups that come in from outside, that's different." "What do you mean, different?" "You need people who understand how these operations work," Jamie said. "People who know how to gather intelligence, how to disrupt supply chains, how to make the cost of operating in an area too high to be worth it." Madison stared at the teenagers in amazement. They were discussing criminal organizations and counter-operations with a sophistication that suggested they'd grown up around adults who knew these systems intimately. "Do you know people who can handle that kind of thing?" Madison asked carefully. "Some of the older folks in the neighborhood have connections," Carlos replied vaguely. "People who used to work in security or law enforcement. They help out when regular channels don't work." Madison spent the rest of the afternoon processing this information while helping with tutoring and activity supervision. By the time David appeared to pick her up, she felt like she understood much more about the world these children navigated daily. She found David in deep conversation with Miguel and Carmen in the office area. This time, she didn't try to eavesdrop. Instead, she positioned herself where she could observe their body language and facial expressions. David was clearly the focus of their attention, with Miguel and Carmen presenting information and David asking pointed questions. Madison watched her adoptive father's transformation as the conversation continued. His posture became more authoritative, his questions more strategic. This wasn't a concerned community volunteer receiving updates. This was someone with expertise evaluating a tactical situation. When the meeting concluded, David's expression was grim but determined. He shook hands with Miguel and Carmen with the formality of someone accepting a serious responsibility. "Ready to go?" David asked Madison, but she could see his mind was still processing whatever he'd just learned. The drive home began in silence, but Madison could feel the weight of unspoken truths filling the car like a physical presence. Finally, her curiosity and concern overcame her caution. "Dad," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." David glanced at her, and Madison saw resignation in his expression, as if he'd been preparing for this conversation and dreading it in equal measure. "Okay," he said simply. "Those kids at the center are dealing with organized crime groups moving into their neighborhoods. And Miguel and Carmen are asking for your help with security issues that are beyond what normal authorities can handle. What kind of background do you have that makes you qualified to deal with those problems?" David was quiet for so long that Madison wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she'd never heard before. "Before I met your mother, before we adopted you, I worked for the government in a capacity that required specialized training and security clearance," he said carefully. "What kind of government work?" Another long pause. "The kind that officially doesn't exist and unofficially protects people who can't protect themselves." Madison felt her worldview shifting as the implications of his words sank in. "Are you talking about intelligence work? Like CIA or something?" "Something like that," David confirmed. "I spent 12 years working on operations that involved organized crime, international trafficking, domestic terrorism. Situations where conventional law enforcement wasn't equipped to handle the scope or sophistication of the threats." Madison stared at her adoptive father, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about him. "You were some kind of secret agent?" "I was someone who specialized in disrupting criminal organizations and protecting civilians who found themselves caught in dangerous situations," David corrected. "When I met your mother and we decided to start a family, I retired from that life completely. I thought I could leave it behind." "But you can't leave it behind," Madison said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Because people like Miguel know what you used to do, and they come to you when regular solutions don't work." David nodded grimly. "For 15 years, I've managed to stay out of it. But the situation developing around the community center involves the kind of organized threat that could seriously harm those children. And Miguel is right that local authorities aren't equipped to handle it." Madison felt a mixture of fear, awe, and sudden clarity about her adoptive father's character. This explains so much about David's quiet confidence, his ability to defuse any situation, his mysterious work schedule, and his reaction to her bullying behavior. "Is that why you were so disappointed in me?" Madison asked quietly. "Because you've spent your life protecting people, and I was using whatever power I had to hurt someone." David pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face her directly. For the first time since she'd known him, Madison saw her adoptive father without any masks or carefully maintained facades. "Madison, I've seen what happens when people with power decide that other people don't matter," he said. "I've seen the damage that can be done when someone decides that their position gives them the right to humiliate or exclude others. And yes, watching you become someone who would use your advantages to hurt a girl like Sarah Kim. That broke my heart in ways I didn't expect." Madison felt tears beginning to fall as the full weight of her adoptive father's disappointment hit her. But underneath the shame, she felt something else, a profound respect for the man who had been protecting not just her, but countless other people without ever seeking recognition or credit. "Are you going to help Miguel?" Madison asked. David was quiet for a long moment. "If I do, it means coming out of retirement. It means taking risks that could put our family in danger. It means potentially exposing you to threats that you've been protected from your entire life. But if you don't help, those kids could be hurt." "Yes." Madison thought about Aisha working on her math homework, about Jamie and Carlos discussing route changes to avoid danger, about all the children at the center who deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods. "Then you have to help them," Madison said firmly. "Those kids matter more than whatever risks we might face." David studied her face, and Madison saw something like pride in his expression. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." Really? Because if you're going to be part of my life while I do this work, You need to understand that protecting people sometimes means accepting personal risk. You need to understand that real strength isn't about maintaining your position over others. It's about using whatever power you have to protect people who can't protect themselves. Madison felt something fundamental shift inside her as she grasped the full implications of her adoptive father's words. The man she dismissed as weak, the quiet family man she'd taken for granted, was someone who had dedicated his life to standing between innocent people and the kinds of dangers most people never imagined. "What happens now?" Madison asked. "Now we go home and tell your mother that our quiet suburban life is about to get complicated," David replied. "And then I make some phone calls to people I haven't spoken to in 15 years. As they drove the rest of the way home, Madison found herself seeing her adoptive father with completely new eyes. The careful way he scanned their surroundings, the subtle assessments he made of every person they passed, the quiet authority in his voice when he spoke about protecting people, all of it made sense now. But more than understanding David's background, Madison was beginning to understand something about herself. Her crisis at school, her cruelty towards Sarah Kim, and her subsequent punishment had led her to this moment of revelation about what real strength looked like. Watching her adoptive father prepare to risk everything to protect children he barely knew was teaching Madison lessons about character that no amount of lecturing could have provided. Real power wasn't about controlling other people or maintaining social hierarchies. Real power was about having the courage to stand up for people who needed protection, regardless of the personal cost. For the first time in her life, Madison Chin understood what she wanted to become when she grew up. She wanted to become someone like David, someone who used their strength to protect rather than harm, someone who chose courage over comfort, someone who understood that true worth came from what you were willing to sacrifice for others. The girl who had bullied Sarah Kim was gone, replaced by someone who was just beginning to understand what it meant to be strong. And her adoptive father's secret had revealed not just his hidden past, but Madison's potential future as someone who might finally be worthy of the love and protection she'd received her entire life. The real adventure was just beginning.